Hello, class. This week we'll explore memorialization and commemoration. At this time, open a Google Doc, write your name, and share it with me. Write down the questions that I will ask throughout the screencast. Your answers are due by 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, November 26th. Now let's get started. First thing I would like you to do is read the following articles: Herbert Muschamp's Architecture View Shaping a Monument to Memory, and Miles Park's Confederate Statues Were Built to Further a White Supremacist Future. And in that Google Doc that I just asked you to open, copy and paste the questions below, and then answer the questions, okay? As you know, there'll be other questions throughout the screencast, so be sure to put the questions and your answers on that same document. So just share one Google Doc with me, okay? So the 3 questions you see in the New York Times article: what does the author mean by the phrase, "a place is a form of knowledge"? How are memorials used as exemplified by both articles? And have you ever visited a memorial? Which one and what was it like? Okay, for the lecture part. Purpose of memorials. Memorials portray pain and suffering, sometimes figuratively, sometimes abstractly. They provide a place for public commemorations and quiet mourning. They seek to link the past to the present through continuously retelling what once happened. So memorials serve as a reminder of people lost and pain endured. Post-conflict memory landscapes embed and convey meaning and are linked to the legacy of the conflict, to struggles over interpretations about the violent past, and to the sites where remembering takes place. Constructing memorials after atrocities has become an important aspect of coming to terms with atrocities and forms a central component of transitional justice. Memorials and commemoration are a more recent application for dealing with the past. And even though memorials have been around for a long time, connecting them to more constructive ways of coming to terms with the past and promoting their establishment as part of transitional justice processes in post-violent societies is a relatively new phenomenon. If you think about memorials of the past, it's often of military heroes or individuals, but rather not for the victims. Key concepts. Memorials are material or virtual objects which serve to represent events or persons who should not be forgotten. When it comes to memorials and transitional justice, the latter refers to victims of human rights abuses during wars, ethno-political conflicts, repressive dictatorships, terrorist attacks, apartheid, as well as genocides. Their main objectives are based on a number of political and ethical ideas, such as providing an adequate site for mourning, holding perpetrators accountable, vindicating the dignity of victims, putting past wrongs right, and contributing to reconciliation. Common language. Memorials often employ a common language communicating a key message, which you'll see over and over again. We must not forget. It is important to note, though, that memorials can never be an accurate replica of the past, but only offer a particular interpretation of an event, which may be contested or subject to change over time. So remember, we spoke about having that common narrative after an atrocity, about what happened in the conflict or the human rights violation. We spoke about this because if we don't have a common narrative after the conflict or the human rights violation, then the memorials will be contested. So their intention, the memorial's intention, is that they seek to fix and store the representation of the atrocity through turning it into a monument that prevails and is available to future generations, often with the intention to educate youth and in doing so prevent the recurrence of the atrocity. So never again is the main slogan of many of these sites. In this sense, memorials exist in the present to tell us something about the past while seeking to affect the future. In terms of material and virtual, memorials may be material and tangible, but they are also increasingly virtual and web-based, allowing for the participation of larger groups of activists in different geographic locations. And there are three forms of material memorials. There's the authentic site at the places where atrocities have occurred. There's constructed sites, which may be anywhere and are often more abstract and conceptual. They could be activities such as commemorations and peace marches. There are a number of different actors that may initiate memorial sites that range from civil society initiatives to national governments or international organizations. Erecting memorials such as the murals, which are paintings on walls in Belfast, Northern Ireland, or on Cairo's Tahrir Square in Egypt, can be spontaneous and inexpensive, rendering it a suitable tool for community action. This process, however, also can be very slow if different parties are involved, including different groups of victims, struggling over the form of or the meaning of a memorial. So, for example, the memorial to the murdered Sinti and Roma of Europe, murdered under the National Socialist regime, was inaugurated in 2012 in Berlin after 20 years of intense debate about its message and aesthetic form. So it could be spontaneous, as mentioned, or it could take a long time in order to erect a memorial. Symbolic reparations. In the context of transitional justice, memorials are often referred to as symbolic reparations, in contrast to material reparations, such as financial compensation. This ties in with an increasing focus on norms on victims. Reparations are often listed as an application of restorative justice since they improve community relations. Recent truth commissions, such as in Liberia and East Timor, have included memorials in their recommendations alongside other mechanisms such as prosecution or institutional reform. The importance of depiction. The way the past is depicted in a memorial depends on the particular experience of violence. After dictatorship and political repression, where violence was mainly top-down and exercised by the government, in many cases, a culture of impunity prevails, which means that they won't be prosecuted. And information about the whereabouts of the disappeared remains concealed. So in such cases, memorials often point at the absence of individuals. Where possible, victims' associations construct them at authentic places such as prisons or torture centers. So, for example, one of those would be Robben Island. Robben Island is a former prison where Nelson Mandela, who was the former president of South Africa, he was held there during apartheid, and it was known as the torture center. It was known as a torture center, which has now become a memorial. The Memorial Landre 38 in Santiago, Chile, is where many political activists disappeared. It's also a place of memorial as well. In terms of ethno-political conflicts where violence occurred between two social groups often either led to the construction of memorials that reinforced the division of the society by claiming an exclusive victim status, such as the Avkara Memorial Center in Croatia, or attempts to foster some form of mutual understanding and potential future reconciliation, as exemplified by the Sierra Leone Peace Museum. So depending on the politics and the identarism in these countries, sometimes these countries are able to overcome identarism, as in the case of Sierra Leone, and they recognize all groups. Or it's going to be like in Croatia, where they only recognize certain victim groups and ignore other victim groups because they were, quote, the enemy. In the case of extreme violence, if violence took on an extreme form to the point of annihilation, such as in the case of genocides, memorials often portray shock and horror, such as in many Rwandan memorials, also on the Cambodian killing fields, through displaying human remains, like including the bones and skulls. Or if some of you mentioned this in the beginning activity, like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where they have the rooms of all hair or all shoes or all like mementos that people who died under the Nazi regime had, and they collected. So the strategy here is to emphasize the enormity of the crime and the magnitude of the destruction. Transitional justice and memorialization. It's a mechanism to deal with a violent past. It's not surprising that memorials have entered the field of transitional justice as potential mechanisms to deal with the legacy of a violent past. Let's look at the historical overview, the memory imperative. Since the 1970s and the 1980s, there has been a memory boom, in particular regarding the commemoration of the Holocaust and World War II, leading to what's called the memory imperative. So that means that remembering has become a duty. And this coincides with an important shift in the culture of remembrance away from commemorating war heroes, such as those who supposedly testified to a nation's strength and invincibility, such as depicted in memorials to fallen soldiers and to veterans. But in transitional justice, memorials focus on the victims. So more recently, victims have become the focus of attention of commemorations. This is central to the rising number of memorials built in the shape of walls of names, such as the Potokari Memorial in Bosnia, or walls with photographs, such as the Kigali Memorial Center in Rwanda, or the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Cambodia. Through depicting the names of victims, they are identified as individuals. And the purpose of this, the attention of naming these victims, is to give them back some of their dignity. Transitional justice and memorialization, a history. Transitional justice, too, has in recent years strengthened its focus on victims, leading to a natural conclusion. In its initial phase, the focus was mainly on perpetrators in order to identify and hold them accountable, which we talked about, retributive justice. Okay? At present, victims are increasingly identified as target audiences of transitional justice. This is apparent in the context of retributive justice, where victims now participate in criminal proceedings at the International Criminal Court, and in their active role in truth commissions, and also in the design and organization of memorials. There's also this shift from the concrete to the abstract. So the aesthetic form of some memorials have changed, giving way to a new kind of memorial. There has been a shift away from figurative depictions of strong, heroic persons or national symbols like military leaders, to more conceptual sites which encourage onlookers to think and reflect. So instead of dictating one particular interpretation of past events, they invite one to form one's own opinion, in a sense liberating and democratizing remembrance. So when there's a problem with that narrative, having more of an abstract memorial helps, because then it's not necessarily focusing on one group. Considering that memorials often make reference to repressive dictatorships, this form of liberating the mind is an important symbolic yet highly political step. These more recent memorial sites avoid solid structures and employ water features. So, for example, with still water serving as a mirror to reflect visitors and the sky, as in the State War Memorial in Perth, Australia. Or, I don't know if you've been there, but I've been there, the running water pointing to the moving of time, such as the 9/11 Memorial in New York. Other memorials would be gardens, and they serve as places for seclusion and reflection, okay, such as the Sharpeville Memorial Garden or the Kigali Memorial Center in Rwanda. They can be open spaces inviting the opening of minds, or they can be narrow spaces transmitting the claustrophobic experience of death and destruction. Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington has a gap in the ground, which is reminiscent of an open wound. In and of themselves, these sites have no symbolic significance which links them to the atrocities. Rather, it becomes a personal experience and interpretation of the visitor that matters, which is very important in transitional justice. Memorials fulfill very different functions, okay? Regarding their positive impact, first, they may serve to reestablish the dignity of the victims through offering a gesture of symbolic reparation. This carries the message that individuals or groups are now accepted and respected by their respective societies. Remember, when we're talking about conflicts or gross human rights violations, we are talking about marginalized people who have not been respected, who have not been taken care of by their government, could be potentially for decades. So the fact that they're being recognized by their country is a very important step for these marginalized groups. In cases where victims were persecuted due to their faith, race, or ethnic belonging, sexual orientation, or political views, publicly acknowledging this aspect affirms they're part of their identity. They stimulate public debate. Memorials have the potential to stimulate public debates about the crimes committed, including discussions about their causes and consequences, and in some cases, also about the conditions to which victims of these human rights abuses are subjected at present, such as continued discrimination and marginalization. This may be of great significance for societies in transition from conflict to peace. They improve relationships. From the perspective of transforming the conflict that caused the human rights abuses, it is occasionally intended that the memorial contributes to improving the relationship between the conflicting parties and to some form of rapprochement between them. Some memorials provide spaces for encounter where people affected can share their experiences and views about past events in order to reduce divisions and strengthen commonalities. This is sometimes linked to promoting a form of memory which contributes to nation building. Memorials can also be sites of resistance. So far, the function of memorials in the context of transitional justice has been portrayed in a rather positive way. Yet, how about the situation in which the suffering of victims of human rights abuses is not publicly known or even subject to denial? So in these cases, memorials are sites of resistance to this culture of impunity and function as an exclamation to draw attention to what is silence. For affected groups, this is often an important element in times of transition. I often think of Cambodia when I speak about this because they have not really acknowledged their genocide. They didn't acknowledge it for a long time. So memorials are important because it gets people asking what happened. Memorials are sites where contestations are fought. So moreover, since the interpretation of the past may be contested by the parties to the conflict, memorials may turn into sites over which this contestation is fought out. They're also sites of bereavement and reflection. So they serve a deeply private purpose as sites of bereavement and reflection. For those that are left behind, they may turn into spaces where they feel close to their deceased or disappeared loved ones. Taking care of commemoration sites may then turn into a ritual which helps the personal grieving process, similar to looking after the grave of a loved one. When I think of this, I think of there's a park in Japan, and it has a phone booth in there. And you pick up the phone and you talk to your loved one. So nobody's on the other end, but when you're grieving, you go there and you talk to your loved one. So it's a process. So it's a memorial to those who are lost, but you can actually speak to, you can speak and pretend you're talking to them on like an old phone booth, and it helps a lot of people. So at this time, we're going to watch this 30-minute documentary called A Cry from the Grave. And it's done by a filmmaker in Bosnia-Herzegovina and also a British director. So the film provides a reconstruction of day-to-day events preceding and following Srebrenica's fall, and it's based on the recordings made during the exhumation of mass graves and testimonies of the surviving families, testimonies of the Dutch peacekeepers, as well as original video recordings from July 1995. So the row of pictures are the row of pictures and posters with quotes, maps, and court verdicts on the walls of the halls provide a framework to the narrative presented in the documentary, and the personal stories are on display. So you're going to watch all three. You're literally going to click on, well, I don't think you can click on them. So I have the little QR codes to scan. So you're going to scan the QR codes. You're going to watch them in order, okay? Then you're going to copy and paste the questions that you see below, the three of them, in the same Google Doc that we've been using. You need to answer these questions with a timestamp from the video and which video they came from. So if it's like video number 1, 5 minutes, 35 seconds, video number 3, 2 minutes and 22 seconds, okay? So you're going to answer the questions that you see here. What atrocities were committed in the country? How are they memorializing the events or assisting victims? And why is it important to do what is being featured in the documentary? So take 30 minutes to watch these videos and then come back to the screencast. So I think it's important to give you a case study of a memorial here. And the case study is in Berlin, Germany. It's a memorial to homosexuals persecuted under the National Socialist regime. And if you look at the pictures on the right, you see there's a giant block and you see a person looking inside, and inside you see a picture. It's the same sex couple kissing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. So the memorial to the homosexuals persecuted under the National Socialist regime was designed and inaugurated in Berlin on the 27th of May, 2008. It was built following a decision of the German parliament in 1999 that a memorial for Holocaust victims should be established and that all other victims of the National Socialism should be commemorated as well. In 2003, Parliament sealed the construction of the memorial and determined its location in the Tiergarten, right in the administrative yet also commercial center of the city, where it was easily accessible to tourists. In terms of its history and why they erected this, persecution of homosexuality began with the takeover of National Socialism in 1933, which was the Nazi Party, when homosexuality was branded as aberrant, and all clubs, associations, and publishing houses were closed down. So according to the plaque at the memorial site, approximately 50,000 men were sentenced, and between 5 and 15,000 were deported to concentration camps, where they had to wear pink triangles called the Rosa Winkel to mark their offense, and by implication, their socially unacceptable sexual orientation, leading to stigmatism among other inmates. So there's a social movement. Prior to the establishment of this memorial, there were a number of smaller initiatives since the 1960s and 70s, increasingly with reference to the Rosa Winkel, which was the pink triangle in the concentration camps. After the German federal president publicly acknowledged in Parliament in 1985 that homosexuals had been victims of Nazi persecution, memorial sites in former concentration camps like Dachau followed. And the gay community was very key in this as well. Since the memorial was inaugurated 83 years after the beginning of the Nazi Party, there were hardly any detainees or concentration camp survivors left to use it as a site for personal grievance or reflection. So the campaigns for its establishment were not driven by survivors themselves, as is often the case with memorials, but by members of the contemporary gay community and by associations of homosexuals who were concerned about both discrimination in the past and in the present. In terms of its construction, the memorial consists of a tall, single concrete block with a small square window through which the visitor can watch a film depicting the kiss of a same-sex couple. The concealed screening of the same-sex kissing scenes render them visible and invisible at the same time. So they're hidden from view by being inside the block, but nonetheless they are there. So what does it mean? This oscillation between presence and absence continues until today, as one of the artists states, quote, "Today we accept homosexuals, but we don't want to see them," end quote. So the memorial draws past injustices into the present and serves as a symbol against current and future stigmatization of homosexuals. It also reestablishes the dignity of victims. So that was a key reason behind the memorial. This was important regarding the period of National Socialism, but also because persecution of homosexuals did not end with its demise in 1945. So, in fact, there was continued persecution. In West Germany, the anti-homosexual codes were applied until 1969 and really not even completely lifted until 1994. And moreover, between 1950 and 1969, over 100,000 legal investigations were opened and approximately 59,000 men were sentenced for being homosexual. So as a consequence, there was a culture of silence around the persecution and prosecution of homosexuals. The continuing criminalization and stigmatization kept victims from coming forward to tell their stories or even to demand reparations. So there was this lack of compensation. So while the Jews, the Sinti, and Roma were labeled victims of the Nuremberg laws and were eligible for compensation, other victims of fascism had access to some sort of monetary and social rehabilitation, but homosexuals, asocials, criminals, victims of euthanasia, and forced sterilization had no right to claim any kind of reparations. So to finally gain some public recognition through the memorial was thus a major achievement. And in a sense, the memorial serves as a belated sign of resistance in the form of culture, in the former culture of impunity. It's also sparked public debate. A further achievement of the memorial is to encourage public debates about past injustices. Against the backdrop of silence in the years following National Socialism, it helps to draw their plight into the public realm. There's also contention, too. Many memorials have contention that surround it. The main contention about this memorial was not and is not about the existence per se, but about who it's for. In its initial conception, the memorial was for gay men only, since they were singled out by the anti-homosexual codes. And there is very little record and evidence of lesbians being targeted during the National Socialism movement and the ensuing decades. But from a feminist perspective, it was argued that women too were affected by the Nazi regime, even though they were less frequently sentenced and arrested, and that women, as well as men, continue to suffer from homophobia today, again linking the past to the present. So the conceptual opening of the memorial to both sexes led to heated debates about historical accuracy on one hand and the perpetual exclusion and invisibility of homosexual women in society on the other. So let me read that one more time. It's really important. The conceptual opening up of the memorial to both sexes led to heated debates about historical accuracy on one hand and the perpetual exclusion and invisibility of homosexual women in society on the other. So in your Google document right now, I would like you to write down the following question, and I would like you to answer it. So in the Google Doc, write this. Should lesbians be included in this memorial if they were not as persecuted as homosexual men during World War II? Should lesbians be included in the memorial if they were not as persecuted as homosexual men during World War II? Go ahead and write that down and then answer that question in the same Google Doc we've been using. Transitional justice and memorialization, other considerations. Often serving as a reminder of a tragic past, post-conflict societies establish memorials in order to prevent the recurrence of such tragedies, right? That never again idea. In this context, memorials are often regarded as having a positive impact on transitional justice processes. Yet, transitional justice and transitional societies is always a political process, as we have talked about the whole semester. And we have to maintain a critical stance towards the political implications of commemorating a past. So the same thing I'm about to read is the same thing that you see on the screen. We should be aware that only certain memories, testimonies, and events become part of the official narrative of the past and are thus to be commemorated, while others that challenge this narrative are to be forgotten. Memorials in such settings tend to provide the victors or power holders with a mechanism of imagining a new nation through the narratives of the past that they disseminate. The memories reflected in and reproduced by such memorials are deeply contested, severely politicized, and highly divisive. And as memorials are open to an infinite number of interpretations, they can readily slide into contested and contradictory narratives about history, specific events, victimhood, and victory. This may in turn be counterproductive to reconciliation and conflict transformation. It's like everything else that we talked about this semester, every other transitional justice mechanism, memorialization is also could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, depending on the society. For transitional justice and memorialization, there are other considerations. So transitional societies often also include counter memorials, okay, as discussed, as you can see here. So read the yellow part. Pause this and read the yellow part of the screen. So memorial groups and individuals who feel excluded, silenced, or forgotten, they'll often initiate non-official, alternative grassroots way of representing the past. So such counter memorials do not represent, quote, the right memory, end quote, but can become a collective social symbol with the ability to encapsulate and perpetuate certain identities and claims may be established in resistance towards a uniform and exclusive memorialization process. Counter memorials are important as they reveal the danger of uniform interpretations of the past and encourage multiple interpretations of the past, right? Because you could be both a victim and a perpetrator, as we saw in the example of Alice in Uganda. Okay, so creating these memorials sometimes causes resentment. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Lack of recognition of women. Commemorative landscapes, particularly those who evoke the memory of war, are clearly gendered as they produce and reproduce the experiences and narratives of men and often silence women's interpretations of the war, which we have seen. I mean, how many memorials do you see to women out there, right? Feminist scholars have raised the question, what role do commemorations and memorials play in dispelling or affirming the gender order in post-conflict contexts? In transitional societies and in war-torn societies, male war heroes or war veterans are frequently commemorated, but the varied experiences of women often remain excluded or silenced in the construction of the meta-narratives of the past that is represented in the memorials. Thus, there's an urgent need to discuss the gendered nuances of commemoration in transitional societies through a critical examination of commemorative material culture such as monuments and memorials. And finally, post-memory. Post-memory is another critical aspect of the connection between memorialization, memory, and transitional justice. By handing down through the generations a version of events that reproduces identity and anchors memory in the site of the most intense experiences, memorials are key to transferring memory across generations and to intergenerational commemoration and remembering. Memorials derive their importance from the ideas and values that are projected through them, and it is these ideas and values that are not fixed in time and can be dissonant, and they can reject official historical narratives to present an alternative reading of place and memory. Okay, so at this time, I'd like you to take a moment and just watch this very short video, I think it's 4 minutes long, on the Chilean coup in 1973. Okay, so pause the screencast and watch this 3-minute history. Okay, now I'd like you to go and read the article, Tracing Collective Memory. It's in the same Google Doc that we've been using. You're going to copy and paste the questions you see below, then answer the questions, okay? Be sure to put the numbers where you found the information. The article is in week 12 in the files section of Canvas. You can find this article in the files section, which is week 12. You'll find Tracing Collective Memory, okay? So I would like you to read that. It's about 10 pages long. What does CLEP mean by thickening collective memory? How are truth and reconciliation connected? The Reddig Commission recommended that monetary and symbolic reparations include victims from both sides. Sorry, that should be a period. Why was this controversial? What are your thoughts? And who is Via Grimaldi? Okay, so you're going to find the article in week 12 under the files section. You're going to read it and you're going to answer these questions. Okay, so you answer these questions in the same Google Doc. Copy and paste the questions and then answer them. Okay. Also, in the same Google Doc, I would like you to copy and paste the questions below and answer these questions. So it's a very, very short article on Rebuilding the Vanquished, Memorialization as Meaningful Restorative Justice. Okay. So you're going to read these questions, answer the questions. Okay. All right. And then finally, the last assignment for tonight. You're going to go right now to the announcement section on Canvas. You're going to find the announcement that contains the restorative justice example. I posted it last week. We talked about it last week. Read the example on Syria. Then read the next 2 slides in this presentation about the Restorative Justice Project. So it looks like this and it looks like this. Read those 2 slides. Then I want you to think about which group in the United States you will discuss in your restorative justice project. So you want to do a little research now, you do a little bit of Googling, okay? Then you're going to copy and paste the questions below in the Google Docs you're submitting tonight and answer these questions, okay? Which group is your focus? Why are you focusing on this group? What injustices have they endured? What transitional justice practices has the United States enacted to assist your group? Has the assistance worked? If yes, how do you know? If no, how do you know? And I apologize, I should have a question mark there for how do you know. What justice mechanisms would you suggest to help your group and why? Okay, and if you look, here are all some examples that you could utilize, okay, for your group. Again, put it in the same Google Doc that you're submitting tonight and answer these questions, okay? And finally, next week's readings. It's our last class, okay? So we're going to now focus in on countries that are not in transitional justice, okay? So when you're reading these, there's a couple things you're going to be reading here. I want you to think of the questions that you see above. Should established democracies like the United States utilize transitional justice? Why does the United States resist the use of transitional justice? What kind of human rights violations has the American government at both the local and national level used to violate the human rights of African Americans? So you're going to read Jesse Daniels' 9/11 Memorials, Anti-Arab Hate Crimes and Restorative Justice. You're going to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. You're going to explore the website of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And on that website, you're going to find a video that's called Why Build a Lynching Memorial. It's a very short video. You're going to read that. And then finally, you're going to look at a report from the Equal Justice Initiative, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror, Part 6, Trauma and Legacy of Lynching. Okay, so it's our last class that will be together, and I look forward to seeing you. Have a great Thanksgiving and be safe.